Hello, my name is David Martinez, and today we're going to talk about how to make long-term travel a reality. So, a question that often comes up with long-term travel is how do you get started? How do you afford it? How do you do it financially? And do you put money away? Do you have to save up enough money so that when you come back, you can survive for a number of months? I get this question all the time. I'm sure you get this question all the
Oh
time. Do
yeah,
you have a go-to answer?
it's a basic question, and I think the answer can be freeing to people who haven't considered it yet. And one is it's really just a matter of freeing up enough time to make it happen. Just sort of realizing that you don't really need to throw money at a year-long trip like you might be tempted to on a shorter vacation. That you can actually go a lot slower. You can travel in local economies in cheaper parts of the world. And you can actually, with the money you've saved, you can travel full time for less per day than it would cost to live in a city like Portland or New York or Austin, right? Just because every meal is going to be exponentially cheaper, rent and hotels is going to be cheaper too. Once you realize that that sort of shadow economy of travel, traveling in local economies in cheaper parts of the world, it's just a total paradigm shift. It really enables things like long-term travel to happen, to be something that you internalize.
Yeah, and it's specific to kinds of jobs. I've had conversations with people who can't do it because of their job. And so it involves a much bigger life decision. I'm going to quit my job and go travel for a year or 6 months or whatever, and then come back and then get a different job. I like my job, right? This is my career. This is what I see myself doing. It's a lot easier if you hate your job, because then you work for a number of months, 8, 9 months, even a year, and you put up with this job because you have this end goal in mind, right? In sight. I'm going to save up this money, then I'm going to go have this adventure, and then I'll figure it out when I get back. But not everybody can do that. You did that right out of college. You worked for a number of months and then you took off. Did you ever think about, or were you in the back of your mind was, what am I going to do after this?
Yeah, I think that's always a thing, and especially when you're younger and you're not really sure what you're going to do, even if you didn't leave home. That's worth thinking about, and it's an understandable concern, but now more than ever, it's less of a big issue because the idea of employment is a lot more malleable than it used to be. We're no longer just taking our time card to the factory and punching the clock and coming out after a hard day's work on the assembly line, especially since the pandemic. Remote work, just the idea that people would need to physically be in a room together or do a 45-minute commute down an interstate highway, that's less important now. So I think even people who aren't interested in travel, they're working in different ways anyway. They're working in a location independent way. And then another thing too, it occurs to me that again, we're not punching a clock at a factory. That you can, even if you love your job, you can talk to your boss and say, look, I would love to take a 6-month trip. I'll do an unpaid sabbatical. Like, you don't need to quit necessarily, but you can sort of incentivize it for them. Just say, I'll come back happier. I'll be more dynamic. I'll have these skills. And so I think the idea of time being these blocked off things is different because employment is different. And of course, it really depends on what job you have, but that is an option. And then the other thing, in vagabonding, I call it an anti-sabbatical. It's work that you do to make money for travel, and you aren't necessarily going to be your career. So I worked for 8 months as a landscaper in Seattle, had no real ambition to become a professional landscaper, but it was a way to make good money, and it funded my first vagabonding trip, just like teaching English as a foreign language in Korea. Funded my first big international vagabonding trip. And so especially for young people, that's an option, that you don't need to save a ton of money, but if you can like live in a simple and minimalistic way so that you're not spending $5 on coffee every day, you're making your own coffee, you're cutting out certain expenses, that's paying off in time. And often in travel adventures. So that's another thing that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, you talk about that in your book, Vagabonding. You talk about how preparing or not buying that coffee at Starbucks is a way of traveling already, because you're saving that money so that in the future you can spend one extra day in whatever country or region of the world you're traveling to. But to go back to the job, my response to students or to people who have with whom I have this conversation is, do you really want this? Because it does. It comes with sacrifice. Often you can't take that sabbatical, or often you like your job too much. It's like, okay, and that's fine. You're on a path, on a trajectory. You're on this career, and that's okay. That's honorable as well. If you really want this adventure, if you really want to travel long term, you're going to have to give up part of that. Part of the anxiety in the United States, in particular, is because I don't know what the percentage is. I used to know that 30% or something of Americans take vacation. Like, Americans are so afraid of taking vacation because the fear is that my employer is going to realize that they can do the job without me, or they didn't need me in the first place, or we're more efficient without him or her. And so you're fired as you return from your vacation, or 6 months. If you have this anxiety over a 1 or 2 week vacation, I could imagine a 6-month vacation or sabbatical. But again, I agree with you in that if this is something that you want to pursue, it's planning with enough time in advance, 6 months, 8 months. You worked for 7 months, you said, right? Before you went on your first van trip. So 7 months in advance. It requires a lot of time, and effort and planning. It's not this, I gotta wake up today and say, next week I'm going to go and spend 9 months in Southeast Asia. And I think with that planning, the other thing that we need to talk about is, where do you want to go? It's going to be very different to spend 6 months in Europe than it is in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, the most expensive part of that trip is going to be your flight. Once you're there, it can be very cheap to get around. And then let's talk about the kinds of places where you're willing to stay. Do you need higher end resorts? More comfortable beds? Or do you need to be right first line of the beach?
Right.
And I think that's another consideration when you're planning for these long-term trips. What is? I guess let's go back and define long-term travel, because that's going to be different. Depending on who you are. For some, it's 3 weeks. For others, 6 months. For me, long-term travel, I think of, it's got to be, I'm going to arbitrarily throw out 4 months. Let's start there.
I think I try not to be too rigid about the definition of long-term travel, because I think long-term travel is anything that sort of gets you out of your home cycles and routines. And sometimes a vacation can be a part of that, in that it's a 1 week escape, and then you click right back into your home life. And actually, like 150 years ago, vacations were sort of invented to increase productivity. Like, the factory workers thought, oh, well, they'll come back refreshed and they'll work harder. Well, maybe a vacation is its own reward, right? I think, so often in a work environment, and oftentimes even in a family environment, we defer our best lives. We think, I need to save enough money before I can really start to enjoy myself. Well, parenting is a good example. I know you're a parent, that you can't, so much of our job as parents is trying to prepare our kids to be self-sufficient and financially secure later. But if you're obsessed with that as a parent, then you're going to lose these beautiful moments that you're going to miss later. It's like, I only have my kid at age 2 once. At age 8, they're doing these super cute things. If I'm just worried about disciplining them for some future self-sufficiency, then that is deferring your life to an abstraction called the future. And I think that can happen with work too, is that maybe we sort of like our job, but we like its security, we like the health benefits, things like that. And so it's understandable. But often you have to think about, well, how much of my life am I putting off to the future? And maybe in the near future, I can save enough money in 2 years to travel for 6 months. And then I'm going to remember that more fondly than other things that I've had before. And then, you find ways. I always say that once you're on the road, you become much smarter than you would be studying about travel in your home office. And so you might think, I'm not sure if I want to stay in some dirtbag $12 hotel when this resort has like a free buffet for $200. And once you're on the road, you realize that it's actually more pleasurable often to stay in these cheaper mom and pop economy type things, because a lot of resorts, not to knock them too much, but they insulate you from the reality of the place where you are. And so this is a great double duty thing, that as you're saving money, you're actually traveling in a more dynamic way. And often you're giving more money into the local economy that serves that economy in a useful way.
Yeah. And you could extend your stay too, if you're looking for this long-term experience, or at the very least have a little bit of a nest egg, I guess, when you get back to your home, to your country. You just mentioned deferring your life. I think often we think of travel as something I'm going to do when I retire. I'm going to work until I'm 65, 67, and then I'm going to travel. And I remember I was on a trip in Spain, southern Spain. I remember seeing a bus full of people, and they all came out, and they were all retirement age, and and they came out and took all the pictures of the thing, whatever monument we were looking at, and I remember thinking, that's kind of the mentality. Like I'm going to work, and then I'm going to retire and then travel. But that's a very different kind of traveling, and there's a lot more that you can do when you're younger. You can sleep in more uncomfortable places. You're going to do perhaps more hiking and so forth. And so early on, I decided that I didn't want to defer my traveling until the very end. And I had a job in Spain, in Madrid, and I quit the job. My wife and I, we both quit our jobs. She had a great job with Lufthansa. And she took speaking of leave of sabbaticals, in Europe, it's not uncommon to take, they're called excedencias, like sabbaticals. And she took a 5-year sabbatical, which I love it when she tells her American friends about this 5-year leave of absence, unpaid, of course. But in those 5 years, she got to keep her benefits, her tickets.
Oh, that's great.
And so she took this 5-year leave of absence, and we bought a one-way ticket to Taiwan. We had a friend that we had met during our travels, and I think we met him in Cambodia. And we landed in Taiwan, and within 3 weeks, we had apartments, we had scooters, we had jobs, and we ended up staying for 2 years. And I tell that story because I think there's this anxiety of, I need to go to a place where I have everything set up. I need to have the apartment. I need to have the job lined up, because what happens if? And I don't, to the degree in which you are adventurous or able to fail, quote unquote, I always thought the worst thing that's going to happen is I'm going to have a great time in Taiwan. Maybe we'll travel around a bit more, and then we'll come back to Spain and we'll be failures. The idea was to go to Asia or go to Taiwan or wherever and spend a couple years there, and we failed. That's the worst that could happen. Another friend of mine did something similar, where he quit his job and went to Colombia, and he was there for about 5 weeks and came back and said, it wasn't for me. So the worst case scenario, he's got 5 weeks that he spent in Colombia. And so that's the kind of conversation I like to have with people. It can seem a little bit dangerous, I guess, but it really is not, if you can get over this idea of, maybe I'll fail, but even failing is going to be this great success and / travel story.
I think it's letting go of expectations too, because if you go to Colombia or Bulgaria or wherever with the idea that you're going to tick something off your box or advance your career or find a new passion, and then if it doesn't happen, well, you've still been in an interesting place. Just imagine how forgettable those 5 weeks or whatever would have been if you were at home in your old routines. And so I think it's a win-win type situation. And oftentimes we're sort of inculcated in American society to assume that there are very specific things that indicate success in life. I taught at some Ivy League schools for a while, and a lot of my students, they were able to have, like, by their mid-20s, internships that led to 6-figure income jobs, which is what they had sort of desired their whole life, because it sounds cool to have a six-figure income. And they were stressed out by age 26, right? And so it's that sort of redefinition of success. I think sometimes we don't know the best way to spend, well, we'll use like a 6 month as an example. Well, they spent a lot of time, they were working 60-hour weeks on Wall Street, towards this abstract goal of air quotes success, actually, and they flamed out and considered that sort of a negative time in their life. Well, all the better to go to the other side of the world. If it's not going to be super successful, at least you have tasted new foods and made new friends and had a really super memorable way to not succeed in the way you thought you had.
Yeah. I think you and I have a similar experience in that we both decided to teach English abroad. I talk to students often about how this is a fairly easy way to do long-term travel, especially in Southeast Asia, maybe a little bit more difficult in Europe, though still possible, and then South America as well. So we talked about how much money you need at the beginning. Well, we didn't give a specific figure, but of course it's going to depend on where you go. But to have, a chunk of money, I think we went to Taiwan. I think we had $3,000, something in that vicinity. Of course, in a way, it was cheating because we had my wife's, fairly cheap tickets. I think we paid $100 for a one-way ticket from Madrid to Taipei. So you might need a little bit more money, but we did have a chunk of money, and then we had an escape route. We had the option of always coming back to Madrid, to Spain, or even to the United States. So I think teaching English is a great way. And again, this is similar where in South Korea, I taught English in South Korea for a summer. And I remember one of the first nights the expats, other teachers, we were walking from the school and we're going out to dinner and we're about to cross the street. And this lady comes up to us and says, "Hey, are you English teachers?" So we were foreigners, obviously. And we said, "Yeah." And she's like, I'm looking for English teachers. Would you, would you consider working for my after school school? After school, what do you call it?
They're called hagwons.
Hagwons, yeah, I couldn't think of the word. Yeah, hagwons.
Like a language institute.
Yeah, exactly. And we said, no, we have a job already. I'm sorry. And then after my time, I was there for the summer. I had 3 offers to stay for the next year to teach English. So it is very easy. But at the same time, I want to be careful to say, it's really easy, go and teach English. I also stress the importance of learning how to do it well. How to be professional, partly because in Taiwan, often the English teachers have a pretty bad reputation. They're kind of using teaching English abroad as a way to travel. So to give you an example, in Taichung, a lot of the schools they'll pay you a monthly salary, but then they'll give you bonuses. All right, and the bonuses are if you don't call in sick, we'll give you a bonus. If you show up on time, we'll give you a bonus. And I was floored when I heard about this because that's what you're supposed to do.
Right.
But so many English teachers were there and they were partying till, all hours of the night and then calling in sick the next day and so forth. And so I think there's a balance there. Yeah, teach English abroad. It's a great thing to do, but be professional, be good in what you do.
Yeah. And I think that goes all the way down, that basically be present and be your best self in all these situations. And that's a huge cliche in Korea, is that we're just knucklehead foreigners coming in, earning more money than they were used to, not really caring about it, sort of complaining and feeling like, they were victims. Korean people are judging me. And it's like, you're a guest in another culture. Yeah. Do some study, just try to be a better teacher, because you'll be less depressed actually if you take some pride in your work. I think it's worth acknowledging here too, that long-term travel can be anything from like a 3-week study abroad program. It's anything that gets you out of your local habits to like a 10-year journey around the world. Yeah. But I don't think that there's a contest like you're a better traveler the longer you travel. I think some travelers fall into that. And so I just want to make sure that anybody who's listening to this understand that you can take long-term travel is very much self-defined. Actually, some of the saddest travelers I've met on the road are people who are in year 6. And they're so proud that they're still traveling after 6 years, but they don't really do anything interesting. They sit around with other travelers and brag about how long they've been traveling, but that's about it. So I think that you have permission to design your own long-term journey. As it, obviously teaching English abroad was rewarding and fun for you, as it was for me, although it was hard at times. But you don't necessarily, like often there's the term gap year, which is less common in the US than the UK and Australia. And so 1 year is a common length for a long-term journey. And it's a good measuring stick. You can do a lot in a year, but that doesn't mean you have to go for a year. I think some people can go for 4 months and completely blow their mind and have new paradigms that they can bring home and give back to their community. Whereas other people think they're going for a 4-month trip and then they get offered that English job, or they run into an opportunity in like IT in this part of Singapore and suddenly they are starting a business. And so I think that fluidity and not thinking that there's any one standard of long-term travel that you have to hew to is good to keep in mind. A year can be great, 10 years can be great, but a few months can be great too, and can spin you in new directions that can really be rewarding.
Yeah, this goes back to what we were saying about expectations. If your expectation is I'm going to travel for 10 years, like my friend who was in Colombia, his plan was to be there long-term, learn Spanish and so forth, and then came back after 5 weeks, realizing that wasn't for him. In the same way that a short trip, a 3-week trip, could turn into this much longer thing. Yeah, I like your distinction, long-term travel. The other thing too is study abroad for a semester is a great way to do or to get started on long-term travel, because what happens with semester abroad programs is you spend a semester in Spain, but then on the weekends, you have a long weekend, you might go on vacation to Paris or to Italy or somewhere. So now you're kind of, you're in a different context, which is your new home, oikos, and then from that home, you're going on vacation to a different country, and then you're coming back to your new home, which isn't really your original home. And that can do a lot to you or intellectually and so forth. I love also what you said about, it doesn't make you a smarter traveler. As much as I've traveled all over the world, I was in Niagara Falls with my wife, and we got ripped off by some kind of tour guide who wanted to take us around, and it sounded great, and we jumped into this van, and it was a total ripoff. So I don't think you're right. I think that you can become more savvy, but just because you've been around the world and been ripped off in other parts of the country doesn't mean that's going to stop happening.
Yeah, and you have to forgive yourself those occasional mistakes, because that means you're pushing your comfort zone and you're trying new things a little bit. Making the same mistake multiple times is probably not as rewarding as finding new ways to make mistakes, right? And I think my nephew, I got a text from him this morning. He just arrived in England, in Oxford, for his first ever study abroad program. And he's going to take a lot of side trips too. Like he's going to meet my wife and me in Paris this summer. I'm sure he's going to go hiking in Scotland and things like that. And so one fun thing about study abroad, which is something I never did, is that it gives you a new home base from which to do that. One, staying in one place is sort of new and exciting. And then all of a sudden it's like, really? I can fly to Brussels for $50? I'm going to go to Brussels,
Yep.
And that's literally a story that happened when my wife was studying drama in London. She found that everything is so close and fun that you could spend your spare time in London, which is a great place, or you could go to someplace cool that's closer than most U.S. states are when you're home.
Yeah, our students in Lithuania, when they study abroad there, they will often find tickets for $10 or $20 to Milan or to different cities in Europe. Again, Europe is it's big, but it's there are countries that are right next to each other, and so it's easy to experience all these different cuisines and different different countries. So we talked about kind of the cost. Think about like a chunk of money, tickets. Think about the kinds of places where you're going to stay. We talked about teaching English abroad. I know the foreign service also, that's another thing that I was considering for a while. And I don't know if you have any experience or if you talk to anybody who's been in the foreign service. What always appealed to me about it is that you don't really get to decide where you go, and you spend. They won't let you spend more than 2 to 3 years. The foreign service, this is the State Department, right? This is, and there are different categories. You can be an ambassador, which is at the very top, or you can be kind of the more clerical kind of people, I guess towards the bottom, if we're going to use this, kind of hierarchy. Forgive me if I'm used that incorrectly. I'm not super familiar with the foreign service, but I started the application process a couple of times, and that's another great way to travel and see the world. The idea that you could spend 2 to 3 years in one country, it seems like a chunk of time where you could learn the language, you could learn about the culture, definitely long-term stay. Do you any other ideas or ways of long-term traveling?
Yeah, well, I don't have a lot of experience with foreign service type situations, but when I taught at Ivy League schools, I taught at Penn and Yale for a while. My students were really locked into that, because I think when you have, an elite school on your resume, the foreign service is probably staffed by people from elite schools. They're going to say, yeah, we'll take this guy from Yale. I try to encourage my Yale and Penn students not to fall back on that. Like, just go out and have a knucklehead 6-month journey around Asia or Europe. Have fun, enjoy yourself. It's not a homework assignment. Sure, you get some money in the foreign service, but just save some money working at the ice cream stand or whatever, and just have an adventure, and then you'll have context for your foreign service assignment. And so I think I tell this to digital nomads too, because digital nomadism is such a big movement now that
Which is another way to long-term travel.
It's
right?
absolutely a way to long-term travel, and it can be dynamic if you allow yourself to do so. But there are now expatriate compounds with good Wi-Fi in places like Bali and Cancun and Tbilisi, Georgia. And that's great. But what happens is somebody will move from Bakersfield to Tbilisi, and they don't really meet anybody in Georgia. And they're sort of working just as hard as they were back. They're still working a 60-hour week. They just have, a country with better cheese and wine or something. And so for all of these situations that feel like good fixes, I try to encourage people to have a ragged edge personal adventure first. So if you're going to join the foreign service, great, but just go backpack around Africa or Europe or Asia for a while first, and then you'll have better instincts for how these work. You will have made those mistakes that you will make you a better employee of the foreign service, and just sort of give you a more intuitive understanding of how other cultures work outside of the classroom. Because I think sometimes we're going from like a classroom here to a foreign service job here. We're going from our IT office in California to an IT office in Cancun, and you're not really learning much in the interval. So that's a long-winded way of saying don't be afraid to give yourself a ragged-edged personal trip before you find ways to make it more remunerative.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about perspective. I always thought the digital nomading world appealed to me because it seemed amazing that you could work for 2 hours a day and live kind of in the same, with the same kinds of things that you would in the United States, working 8-hour days, right? So the appeal of working in Bali and then surfing for a couple hours, working for a couple hours, and then traveling around Indonesia or the Philippines and so forth. That's what's appealing. And with teaching English abroad, it was kind of similar. The comparison in Taiwan, the comparison that was made is that we make as much money as like a fairly successful dentist in Taiwan. And so for me, that meant I'm going to work Monday through Thursday. I'm not going to work 5 days a week because I can live, we can live more frugally, and I want free time. That's what I wanted. And I did the same thing when I was teaching English in Spain. I worked it out. You work for a year, learn, figure out how things work, and then you decrease those number of days. It's the same thing. I was working Monday through Thursday. So every weekend for me was every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I was traveling, I was climbing. That's when I was doing a lot more climbing. And so those are the experiences. I think when I think of long-term travel, I think about, I'm not going to take my life here and transplant it somewhere else. How can I maneuver things, move things around so that I can have more free time? And then, at the same time, maybe save some money and so forth. The other, and as a teacher, this is what I fall back on often, but the other way to long-term travel is through these international boarding schools. I think NAIS is one of the websites. There are a few other sites that you can go on, and there's all these American schools around the world, and they're always looking for teachers. Sometimes you need to be certified, not always, depending on what your area is. But that's another great way to if you're more fearful or more nervous or anxious about this, would you call it a rugged experience or rugged edged backpacking trip?
Right, ragged edged.
Right, ragged edged. And you need a little bit more stability, but you still kind of want to have this experience. That's another way to have, go work at an international school. They're going to probably pay for your flight to get there. And they're going to set you up with a place to stay. And then another way is going back to teaching English. I know that at Lithuania, LCC, International University, for instance, they have a summer language institute in July where they bring in volunteers to teach English. So that's a great way to get started. You still have to pay for your airline ticket, but they'll give you a place to stay, and you're going to be picked up at the airport. You're going to have that kind of stability, right? And that, I think, will set you off on this path of looking for your own adventure.
Yeah, I presented it the other way around. The idea, do your ragged edge travels first and then get your more formal study abroad or job. When in fact, I sort of did the opposite. I actually worked in Korea first. My plane ticket was paid for. I made a lot of money. And then I did my truly ragged edged travels. So I sort of went against, I think both versions can work. But sure, yeah, if you can get a job at an international school that gets you a place, then like slowly you sort of get your sense for living internationally so that you're much more confident when you get into your ragged edge travel. So I'm not going to be too fundamentalist about when you should do your ragged edge travels and when you should do your more formal ones. But I guess the point is there's a ton of options. There's no one perfect way to do things. And that a lot of times the excuses we make not to leave home and have a long-term experience overseas are founded in fears and anxieties that don't really have any real world relevance, you know?
Yeah, and once you start, you realize that they don't have that relevance. I'm going to recommend your book, Vagabonding, an Uncommon Guide to Long-Term Travel.
Yeah.
Published like 23 years ago.
Yeah.
Re-edited recently this year, last year.
It's all current. The philosophy doesn't change much, the philosophy of long-term travel. A lot of the resources and the language changes every few years, so I do some updates, but...
I wondered about that because I have the original edition, and some of the sites that you have at the end of the book, I wonder if they're still...
I think it might be 0% of those websites work. But the funny thing is that people Actually, I've kept all those websites current on vagabonding.net. So if you go to vagabonding.net/resources, they're all updated anyway. You don't actually have to buy the book to get those, because those have been updated quite faithfully for 20 years now. But the life philosophy, ideas like time wealth, that is more less specific to a certain historical era.
Right. And I've recommended this book to people who don't even want to travel, and they've talked about how you're right. It's less. Well, it is about travel, of course, but it's also about perspective and about how you want to live your life and kind of reorganizing your priorities and so forth. So I think it's a great book. Not very long either. Reads very quickly, very easily. So that's my recommendation. You got a recommendation?
Yeah, I would recommend any of the anthologies by Traveler's Tales, which is published out of San Francisco. They published my second book, Marco Polo Didn't Go There. And they've been friends for a long time. But every year, or nearly every year, they put out best travel writing and best women's travel writing. And these are just collections of maybe 20 or so stories about different aspects of travel. Sometimes it's not long-term, but it usually is. It's usually written by people who know travel really well. And one great thing about an anthology is that you're not stuck with one person for 200 pages. You're sort of jumping from different perspectives. And so that you're not just getting one guy or woman's perspective, but you're jumping from a lot of different perspectives to give you different examples of this. And it's misadventures as well as adventures, and it's fun. Traveler's Tales is, I think it's probably travelerstales.com, and they have a ton of books, and it's a good place to start when you're trying to get a taste for what might be out there.
Should we spin the globe?
Yeah.
All right, you ready?
I'm ready. I like this spin the globe business. Oh my goodness. Let's say Grenada or Cuba?
We got to go Cuba.
Okay, yeah. I was close enough to Cuba that we may as well, because I know that you have a personal connection to
Cuba. I do have a
Cuba.
personal connection with Cuba because I am half Cuban, and I did spend a week there, and I loved spending a week there, partly because I didn't have any technology, and my phone wasn't ringing every couple of seconds. And it was great to see the place where my father was born, and the culture that he was raised in. But Plaza Revolucion, again, was just an amazing place, a kind of throwback, to what I imagine the world was before the internet, right? Where people just kind of gather and they talk about the news and baseball and so forth. But you have an interesting story in Cuba as well. You have an interesting connection in Cuba as well.
Yeah, well, I went there by way of the Dominican Republic in 2007, and I spent a month there. I thought I was going to be writing a book about how to learn Latin American dances, like merengue and salsa and samba and things like that. Because at that point in my travel writing career, it's like, yeah, I can climb a mountain, but I've climbed a lot of mountains. Maybe I should learn to dance in a way that I don't know how to dance. Well, that book sort of failed for a number of reasons. One of which in Cuba is that I befriended... I like hired a tutor and I was taking dance lessons every day, but through a friend of a friend, I befriended this group of young people who play the bagpipes at the Asturian Federation. And so it's sort of an immigrant society that's been there since the 19th century from a Celtic part of Spain. And the bagpipes are a big deal. So it's sort of these young, the best word to describe them would be hipsters, like people in their mid-20s, very well educated. They didn't want to dance to salsa. Their grandma danced to salsa. They wanted to learn the bagpipes, and they were good, actually. So I hung out in Havana for a month, learned a little bit of salsa, but mostly hung out with these amazing bagpipe playing Cubans and just had a delightful time. And the lesson I got from that is that that's one problem with expectations. Just when you think that Cuba is expressed through salsa and son and old American cars
and cigars
and cigars and
mojitos,
daiquiris or whatever they serve there, then suddenly you're having the time of your life playing the bagpipes in Cuba. And so I love that. I tell that story. I'll probably always tell that story because it was such a delightful surprise that I couldn't have predicted, but it's what I remember Cuba now.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so my hope is that people listening to this podcast will look at a map of the world, dream and vision of a long-term travel with whatever expectations, but then they'll protect those expectations a little bit, liberate them a little bit, and then figure out a way to do long-term travel, because it is important to travel, to see new places, meet new people, try new things, and be safe most of the time.
This video podcast is a production of George Fox Digital. To find more material like this, you can subscribe to George Fox Talks on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Our team really appreciates your feedback in the form of likes, comments, and reviews, and we'd really love to hear what you think. To sign up for our weekly email list and to keep up to date with the latest episodes and publications, you can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.